This mini greenhouse is a veritable haven for any tree-dwelling reptile or amphibian. Or if you just want a mini greenhouse in your living room. Who wouldn't want a mini greenhouse in their living room? 36 inches tall with solid branches for perching, 2 removable hides, and a whole slew of high techie stuff. In the next 20 minutes or so, this champion terrascaper, that's right, it's me, will be giving you a detailed step-by-step masterclass in terrascaping or terrarium building. We'll be covering materials, building techniques, backgrounds and built-in features, common tech and how to use it, hardscape selection, plant selection, new ecosystems and what to expect, and of course the final results. This build would be suitable for a wide variety of tree-dwelling life forms. Please do thorough research before purchasing or setting up a new life form. We'll be building this giant arboreal terrarium for my crested gecko. This is Treffy.
I'm Trevor Belmont of House Belmont.
They get their name from the crest that kinda looks like eyelashes that runs all the way down to right before their tail. Treffy has been the highest member of the Guild of Geckonia since he graced the microverse with his sassiness. But he's got a little bit chunkier since his first days and is in dire need of an upgrade. As my favorite YouTuber would say, before we get into the build, allow me to thank Exo Terra for sponsoring this video. Exo Terra makes some of my favorite lifeform related products. And in this video, we're gonna use all of these products to make Treffy here feel at home. Welcome to the Microverse. Sponsored by Exo Terra. Let's start with the lifeform. These awesome lifeforms were actually thought to be extinct until 1994, where by either complete happenstance or divine providence, they were rediscovered. The story goes a herpetologist was visiting one of the islands of New Caledonia, and there was a storm. A gust of wind blew one of these little guys into his lap, and thus they were rediscovered. You're eager to get in there, aren't you? Cresties, as they are called, are arboreal, meaning they live primarily in trees, and come from the island of New Caledonia. And since their rediscovery, they have boomed in popularity as a pet. Little Treffy, or Trevor Belmont here, was gifted to me by my amazing friend Faddy of Daffy's Reptiles. If you're remotely interested in fauna lifeforms, go show him some love. I'll link his channel in the description below. Here is a list of materials that I'll be using to build this amazing mini greenhouse. I'll put a link to all of these materials in the description below. This ginormous terrarium, the PT2608, it is the medium X tall. It measures 24 by 18 by 36 inches, or 60 by 45 by 90 centimeters. The brand new TerraSky UV LED light that has so many features, I really can't wait to show you guys. A Monsoon Multi-2 misting system, a programmable misting system with a very sizable reservoir, a large heat mat, the thermostat for said heat mat. Always use a thermostat for your heating element with your reptile or amphibian. 2 hides that I shall be incorporating in the background. I mean, can you tell there are 2 hides in the background? A canopy feeding dish that I will also be incorporating in the background, as well as all the materials needed to cover the background and create my substrate mix. Here are some of the things that I'll be using that are not produced by Exo Terra. Great Stuff Gaps and Cracks Expanding Foam. It's great! GE 100% silicone, corrugated plastic, a plastic screen mesh barrier, and leca for the false bottom. Here are some of the tools that I'll be using. A sharp knife, a razor scraper, bent aquascaping tweezers, bent aquascaping scissors, a paintbrush, and a lot of rubber finger protection apparatus thingies. Before we start planning, let's talk a little bit about the canvas, the Exo Terra Medium X-Tall Paludarium. I'm a big fan of their latch system and underdoor ventilation that keeps the glass from fogging up. And even though I do like the foam background that these terrariums come with, I will not be using it in this build. I also love the cable management system in these terrariums. I usually start with a loose idea of what I want and see what the hardscape wants to do. The idea is to make a sort of fey trap formation using rocks and wood. But since this is such a large enclosure, I just might add a floating mountain here or there. But first we should account for the heat mat. I want the heat and humidity grid to be vertical, imitating a rainforest canopy, with the hotter, drier part being the top and the cooler, humid side being the bottom. As with the previous build, I would like to add planters, embedded in the background. I do this to give vertical humidity pockets and to be able to add plants that are otherwise not epiphytic to the background. The canopy dish will also be embedded in the background. Ooh, Forgot to mention that both hides will be detachable from the background, just for safety purposes. And because I like cool techniques that makes things sort of blend into the background, but also detachable from the background. The misting system nozzles will go on both front corners of the terrarium, though I might mess around with it just because of how this big piece of wood is situated. The foaming itself is not very technical. First, I lay down all my elements and mark where they go. I do try to think of how it would eventually look like in the end. I start by creating a parameter around the warm hide's location. This is an area where I want bare glass, or at least no insulating foam, so that the heat can penetrate. I also take this opportunity to lock the main piece of wood. I use a plastic planter to support its weight as the foam cures. I go over and under all the planters and wood to secure the planters and hardscape and to give everything a similar texture when finished. After the background cures, I flip the terrarium on its side and start with the left wall. I always think about where the terrarium's going before foaming. This is to maximize the viewing angle as well as leave some empty space for your eyes to wander. I decided to position the other large piece of wood so that it frames the terrarium when viewing it from the front, and to contrast the other piece of wood when viewing it from the side, or if you're viewing it at an angle. As the foam on the background cures, I start foaming the top of the hides. This is done only to keep the aesthetics consistent throughout the build. I start by fitting the canopy dish to the area I marked and gluing the detachable plastic base to the glass before foaming the canopy dish itself. I foamed the surface of the warm hide and put it in place before locking it in with foam. I also took the opportunity to foam this giant piece of dragonstone to one of the planters. This will act as one of our floating mountains of sorts. Since there is no heat pad on the humid hide, I added a little bit of foam to keep it insulated on the inside. The next day, I carve and fit the cool hide as well as the canopy dish, and proceed to cut out the warm hide. I then add additional foam to reinforce the foam lip that will hold the hides in place. Then starts the long process of foam carving. While it may seem like I'm just hacking and slashing at the foam, there is a method to my madness. I carve to accentuate on the cliffs and caves I created by layering the foam, and I make mostly V-cuts of various sizes, both vertically and horizontally. The result is an overall consistent formation that has cliffs, caves, ridges, and protrusions, mimicking natural rock and soil formations. And if we add a little detailing during the silicone phase, it should be looking like a little slice of forest. I tend to overdo it with the spray foam, and carving this much surface area results in a lot of foam cuttings. So cleanup is due before we do anything else. Before we start the siliconing, Django must do a sniffs and approve of the build. We also must ensure that all materials to be siliconed are bone dry. This is very important, as damp or wet materials will not adhere to the silicone. For materials in the background, I'll be using a mix of cocoa fiber and forest bark. Maybe put some sphagnum moss in certain crevices just to retain humidity in the canopy. Apply a generous amount of silicone. It's good to get it in all the gaps and cracks. I tend to do this in sections to ensure success and have less touch-ups in the future. I press the materials firmly into the silicone to make sure it sticks, but then I will go back and retouch the seams between these sections. After some of the main background is done, I silicone the hides. Even though the Exo Terra hides look natural, I want them to blend seamlessly with the background. And even though there may be some seams, I shall be adding some sphagnum moss and perhaps the magic paste of moss to blend everything together. After siliconing the detachables, I finish the background before adding some details. These smaller driftwood pieces will be perfect for this. I then fit test the thermostat probe before adding more details. Since I want to future-proof this build, just in case I want to add a waterfall or just help drain the false bottom if it overflows, I am adding a sump type structure. I measure the corrugated plastic and cut it in a way that makes a waterproof corner. I then make holes at the bottom of the plastic structure to allow water to pass through. A screen mesh barrier will help keep all the debris and bigger particles out of the sump. After haphazardly siliconing the sump, I rehydrate some leca, or lightweight expanded clay aggregate. I add 3 big bags. After a generous layer has been added, I cut and place the screen mesh barrier. This is essential to keep the substrate out of the false bottom, where water can pool and quickly turn your terrarium into a bog. It is right after the screen barrier that I like to add my first stage of bioactivity, tropical springtails, or Folsomia candida. I have this culture that I have been raising for a while now. I add them to this level of terrarium for two reasons. They are perfectly situated between the substrate and the leca, so they can use the leca to establish before getting to work on the substrate. I also like adding the charcoal they breed in, because the carbon acts as a purifying layer for the water passing through it. The substrate I will be mixing for this build needs to be fluffy, retain humidity, and have enough nutrition for the amounts of plants that I'll be adding. I mix roughly 1 part of each of these: Exo Terra plantation soil, Exo Terra forest bark, Exo Terra substratum, sphagnum moss, and a couple of bags of tropical substrate mix from my local pet store. Shout out Critter Jungle. I mix thoroughly before adding the substrate and sloping it towards the back. I also take some time to create a little lid for the sump, using a piece of corrugated plastic and a piece of cork bark. I also add some dragonstone to the understory to tie it visually to the background, which has similar structures. Before getting into the plant selection, let's talk about the tech used in this build. First, we have the Exo Terra heat mat attached to the Exo Terra thermostat. Always use a thermostat when using a heating element. To install it, you peel the sticker and adhere the heat mat to the desired area of the tank. Put the thermostat probe in the area you would like the temperature to be regulated. Plug the heat mat into the thermostat and set the desired temperature using this dial, and simply plug the thermostat in. It will now keep that area at the temperature you have set. More on crested gecko care later. This is the Terra Sky UVB LED light, and this light is amazing. It has built-in UVB and UVA bulbs, 6500K temperature LEDs which are perfect for plants, a built-in timer option that will ramp up the UV as the day goes by to mimic the sun, and you can individually dim the UVA and UVB and LEDs to make your Lifeform feel at home. It even has a UV reactive mode, where if there are elements or life forms that react to UVB, they glow. This is the Exo Terra Monsoon Multi-2 misting system. With an easy-filled giant water reservoir and a timer, I set this to go on for 30 seconds every 4 hours. This will make sure Treffy and the plants are well hydrated. I simply run the tubing through the holes in the top lip of the Exo Terra enclosure on both sides, and fix the nozzles to the glass using the suction cup, and direct the nozzles for optimal coverage. Now that we have the tech all set up, let's talk about plants. These are the plants I'll be using in this build. I do end up adding more, so I'll go through them right now. Bird's nest fern, bromeliad, sansevieria or snake plant, calathea pink, variegated rubber plant. I also had to pull the begonia rex out of amphibia due to derangement, and have a feeling it will do great here. Speaking of begonias, we also have the trailing watermelon begonia. And since we're talking about vines, we have this awesome satin pothos, as well as a variegated ficus pumila, and my favorite one of all, the peacock slaginella. I'm not gonna attempt the Latin name again, I always get it wrong. As well as this velvet philodendron. We're also using some Fetunia, or nerve plant, and so many mosses. Here are all the mosses that I'm using: thread moss, badge moss, hypnum moss, pincushion moss, star moss, live sphagnum moss, and it's not a moss but close enough, Peruvian liverwort. Most of the plant selection was based on what crested geckos would find appealing. Broadleaf plants that are sturdy enough to have the mighty Treffy climb and chill and maybe take a nap on. When fully established, this mini greenhouse should look like a tropical jungle. But before we plant, here is a best practice I use since these plants are going in a vivarium. I remove the plant from the pot and remove all the substrate and dirt I possibly can. I do this to be able to gauge the root system and trim roots as needed, and to prevent any pesticides or fertilizers from getting into a bioactive enclosure. After removing all the substrate, I can wash the roots as an added measure. I start with the 2 bromeliads and fix them in place before adding the bird's nest fern. I then add the snake plants, keeping in mind they might grow till about the middle of the enclosure. I then add the begonia rex in between the snake plants. The begonia's round leaves should contrast nicely with the snake plant's long, pointy leaves. I struggle with the Calathea rosea Before placing it where it has absolutely no room to grow, I also place the rubber plant where its roots will get pod bound, but we'll fix all that. I then add the vines. The variegated ficus pumila was the first, followed by the velvet philodendron, and then the satin pothos. And the slaginella was peppered up and down and all around. Because slaginella, because blue, you guys, because blue. Then planted the trailing watermelon begonia in the understory and propped it up against the background. Knowing this one, it'll root and take over in no time. I then add even more slaginella, blue, you guys, because blue, before giving the vivarium a good spray. The next day, I decide to change some things. I removed one of the bromeliads, because I know how big these guys can get, and then moved the fern towards the corner, before brushing the magic paste of moss on the background. This is essentially powdered substratum and sphagnum moss and some water in a food processor. Creates this paste, and I like using this paste because it provides a perfect growing surface for moss. I then add my first stage of moss. That's right, there's a bunch of moss stages, actually. While all of the mosses are collected from nature, I go through considerable lengths to quarantine and propagate them, in order for them to be safe for vivarium use, or for use with any reptile or amphibian life form. The next day, I realized my mistake with the Calathea rose and the rubber plant, so I moved them. I also added some petunias to give us some color in between the greens. I then moved the rosy one last time, before adding another pothos, and then even more moss. And this is when I went bioactive crazy. Not really, I just added like 4 cultures of orange springtails and another culture of tropical springtails. They will usually lay low when put in a new environment before they start tending to their custodial duties. And then I top everything off with some gravel. Let's talk about crested gecko care for a minute. Cresties are simple. They like temps between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which means you can kind of keep them at room temperature. They also like their humidity high, between 60 and 80%. And since they are arboreal, they like drinking droplets off of the leaves. Cresties have one of the easiest diets to prepare. It's essentially a powder that you rehydrate and kind of present to them, and they love it. I'd like to once again thank Exo Terra for sponsoring this build and this video, and I can't wait to collaborate with them on future videos. After thoroughly inspecting the new build and making sure it is both suitable and to his liking, he leaps into the future with full trust. After a long day of moving, we give him an offering of fruit paste for his troubles. He seems to enjoy it. It has long been believed that Trevor Belmont of House Belmont can predict the weather. Based on his level of sassiness, he can tell you what degree of severity the weather will be. If you would like to get semi-accurate weather predictions from a gecko, you should probably subscribe. And if you like this video and wish there was more, here's a playlist. May the moss be with you.